Well, here we are, 3 weeks before the presidential election in Ukraine, a critical moment in the nation's modern history. And at this stage, we don't know who's going to emerge the victor. And the implications of a potential change or it remaining more of the same are immense. Now, at this stage, and I'm trying to provide the context, we seem to be polarized. The House is divided between those who consider that if Poroshenko loses, and if it's Zelensky or if it's Tymoshenko, because it seems that they are the only two viable, realistic opponents at this stage, though as of today, Hrytsenko is moving forward, is catching up with Poroshenko and Tymoshenko. Well, their view is that it's the apocalypse, basically. It's the end for Ukraine because the others will either sell out the house or make compromises that will be very damaging for Ukraine in the future. And there's been an article by my very good friend, Adrian Karatnycky, in Politico, a very respected European Brussels-based publication, in which last week basically he argued that the case that for Europe the best hope and perhaps the last hope at this stage is Poroshenko, a victory. Now, I take a different view. I think that it's very unfair and unreasonable to get so highly emotive at this stage and to leave reason aside. What we have to consider are the harsh realities. 2.5 weeks before the elections, to be precise, we have a candidate that's emerged from nowhere. Yes, he's obviously promoted by a particular oligarch or forces, but he's a newcomer to the political scene. And from nowhere, he is miles ahead in the polls just before voting. This is a phenomenon or a factor that we have to take into account. And for most of last year, Yulia Tymoshenko, whether one likes her or not, she has led the polls. So what does that tell us? It tells us that Poroshenko has created these problems himself. Zelensky has not simply emerged because Putin wanted him there, or because Tymoshenko, Kolomoyskyi, whoever else. He represents a massive expression of dissatisfaction, disillusionment, and desire for change. Now think about it realistically. You have young people who are prepared to vote for a candidate who has not come forward with the program, who we don't know what he will do, we don't know who his advisors and team will be, but they're prepared to risk everything rather than stay with the same. And I must tell you, as someone living in Kyiv these days, working, you talk to a taxi driver, you talk to your average young person, patriotic young person in some of the places where I hang out, and they all say better Zelensky than more of the same. For them, more of the same means a failure to deliver on the promises and principles of the Maidan and the EuroMaidan and the Revolution of Dignity, a failure to tackle the corruption in this country that remains endemic in a committed way, not in a half-hearted way, a failure to deliver on promises to reform the legal system, etc., etc. And this disillusionment is so deep that the only argument that is given in defense of Poroshenko and by his team is to play on a patriotic note, that without him in command, there will be disaster in the east, the Russians will move forward, Ukraine will somehow cave in. I think this is a very fallacious argument. Of course, he looks good in a military uniform. He's very eloquent when he talks to the outside world. He isn't eloquent, and he doesn't talk much to the Ukrainian people. He hasn't in the last few years. And we don't know how a Tymoshenko or a Zelensky, or how even a Hrytsenko would fare in the role of commander-in-chief. But let's forget, the army that he claims to have created has been created because, A, there were the volunteers that went and defended that border. B, because at that stage, the oligarch that's regarded as so nefarious today, supporting Zelensky, actually sided with Ukraine, Kolomoyskyi, we seem to forget that, and kept the Russians out of Kharkiv, Dnipro, and out of eastern Ukraine. And therefore, you know, it's a bit of a cheap shot to say that if his candidate gets in, it's Armageddon, it's the end. I don't think so. I think that given the very serious charges that have been leveled against Poroshenko, not only most recently in the vital defense sector, but throughout the last 2 or 3, 4 years, and the fact that not one big fish has been brought to trial, not one conviction of anybody senior, and therefore the system, the conclusion that even those that gave him the benefit of the doubt is that the emperor has no clothes, that the emperor is naked, or that the emperor is using smoke and mirror effects like the Tomos, like the Ukrainian language, to preserve his position. Because if he stays in power, those that want him out really worry that it'll be a preservation of the status quo, which means the oligarchic status quo, more graft, more symbolism to reform, but on the other hand, growing disaffection, not just disillusionment within society, greater regional splits as patriotic notes are played up, certainly in advance of the parliamentary elections due next October. And let's recall, and this is very important to remember, that whoever wins in April, after the second round, will be a lame duck president unless they can mobilize enough support in the form of a working coalition to be an effective president and leader from October, November onwards. Therefore, I argue that people will decide, but it's not all over if Poroshenko doesn't win. The fact is that if it's Zelensky or if it's Yulia, they will have to reach compromises as they seek new partners and allies to form a coalition and to build up credibility. They will have to deliver on some of the promises they have made. In fact, Zelensky's made very few promises, if at all. It's Tymoshenko who's being playing on the more populistic side of things, campaigning to lower the tariffs on public utilities, etc., to lower the price of gas that is coming or will come from Russia one day, because apparently we don't receive gas anymore now, and so on and so forth. So if I compare the teams, Tymoshenko has a good team. She has people that cannot be accused of being traitors and of sellouts to Russia, Tarasiuk and others who advise her on foreign policy, Nemirya, etc. These are good, reliable people. And the fact is that she has actually spent the last 6 months or so actually projecting a program. We tend to focus on the populistic side, but she's had major meetings, for example, on legal constitution reform, where people like Shishkin, a top legal authority in this country, and others have been present, on foreign policy, on economics, and she has at least come public with an attempt to forge a programmatic way forward. Poroshenko hasn't done this. He's chosen in this last year, particularly in the last 6 months, to play the on national feelings. And where was he a year ago as regards the Tomos, or the Ukrainian language? Well, his detractors say that he himself was going to a Russian Orthodox Church until recently, something that is now denied and the photos disappear from the internet. So there's a little bit of cynicism and exploitation of national feeling there. And his detractors, his British detractors, would say that patriotism is the last refuge of ... So, these are tense, difficult days. And the amount of mudslinging that's going on is to be expected. But it's not building national unity. And we don't want these elections to end in dividing the country. We spent 4 or 5 years building a political nation, trying to heal the cleavages, trying to build a civil and society and a political nation. And we don't want that to be broken up by last-minute appeals to patriotism and to presenting it in black and white terms. I am the only candidate for a president. Ukraine will collapse without me. And we don't want the other side to say that with Poroshenko things will fail. I mean, if Poroshenko was a statesman of the sort that history demands of him at this stage, he would be talking with a different rhetoric. He would be talking about the need for a government of national reconciliation, of national rebuilding, certainly of rebuilding confidence, public confidence. And he would not be standing in Istanbul as the only recipient on behalf of Ukraine of the Tomos. I, in his position, would have invited the leaders, as is customary in Western countries, to be standing next to him to show that this is a moment that is important for the nation, for all nations. And think back, if I'm to be critical, think back when we had the 100th anniversary of Ukrainian anniversary. We had the Tomos later, but what happened on the 22nd of January 1918? Where were the celebrations and where was the state attempt to mark 100 years of anniversary? And I was struck by the fact that at the diplomatic meeting, the president congratulated Lithuania, Estonia, even Poland, forthcoming centenary of independence. And he mentioned that Ukraine was also fighting for its independence in those months. But he should have asserted that we were first. We actually achieved our independence in the most difficult of conditions. And what we've done now is try to restore it and consolidate it. Anyway, many examples like this. On Zelensky himself, I would say, let's not drive the guy into a corner in the sense that he feels that he's totally unappreciated by a quarter, a third, a tenth of the population, that he is somehow totally unacceptable for them. He has to feel that if he does win, that he's the president of all Ukrainians, Ukrainian-speaking patriots, Russophones, and others. And there's one other factor here. Let's consider. We're rushing ahead. We don't have an organized session here. This is just sort of off the top of my head ideas. But let's look at Zelensky from another point of view. If he is taking votes away from Russophones in eastern and southern Ukraine that would otherwise be voting for the remnants of the regional party, the party of the regions linked to the former president, is that good or bad for the country? We can build on that. And work has to be done with Zelensky. He has to develop himself, but work has to be done with him to placate him and to make him feel welcome as a potential president if he gets there. Not to feel immediately that he's on his guard, that he's not wanted, that there's going to be 15 or 20% that will never accept him. So, and just one other example here. Remember, for those of us who are a bit older, we had a similar sort of situation in the early 90s when Kravchuk, the former communist, let's look at Poroshenko, former minister of the economy in previous regimes, let's say, etc., also with a bit of a nuanced pass. Here is Kravchuk facing the manager of the biggest missile factory in the former Soviet Union, Piudenmash, in Dnipropetrovsk, as it was then, a chap called Kuchma. Who knew of Kuchma then? Russian-speaking with a Russian wife. Again, many people thought, wow, this is the end of Ukraine if Kravchuk doesn't succeed. Within a month, Kuchma, for all his pluses and minuses that were to emerge later, was speaking Ukrainian and was writing books that Ukraine is not Russia. I'm just saying that let's be aware that it is not totally the end. It is a new beginning. So let's focus on opportunities and challenges rather than say, oh, problems, dead end, and bidna Ukraina, Ukraine is not going to pull through. And if it's Yulia, well, I think she has a program that is credible. If we abstract it from some of the populistic elements that have been in the fore and that will be dampened as economic realities sink in. But if she is to build a force in parliament that is to sustain her for the next years, she will have to build national consensus around herself. The other variant, just to conclude my monologue, is of course that Zelensky emerges if both Yulia and Volodymyr, let's call him, and not just Vladimir, as Zelensky gets into power, is that he could end up, if they have the same backers and the same motivation behind backing them, he could quite easily end up as a ceremonial president without really taking many decisions other than initially appointing some of the key ministers that whose names will be suggested to him, in inverted commas, and that Yulia will probably then emerge as the prime minister, something she's wanted, a role. Let's if we say half full or half empty the glass, I would say let's focus on the positive and what the opportunities that we get at this time. Much depends on what will happen in the next 2 weeks. Will there be new scandals discrediting Poroshenko? Will there be situations real or created to promote Poroshenko as an indispensable leader at a time of war and terrorism, provocations, whatever? We don't know what might happen. Will there be some dirt discovered that hasn't been unveiled until the very last minute about any of these candidates? It's still all up for grabs. And though we seem to feel that we know enough now about all of them, that is, we don't know hardly anything about one of them, we know quite a lot about a second one, and we know quite a lot about a third one. But on the day, some analysts say that it depends on the weather. Young people might not go out and vote for Zelensky if it's a bad day. Pensioners might not go out and vote for Yulia if the weather's bad. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side you're on, with each poll, Zelensky seems to be moving forward, and he can afford maybe the 3 or 4 or 5% that won't turn up on that day. He seems to have a pretty convincing lead that, short of a deus ex machina, will project him at least into the second round. I think the key question now is, will it be Poroshenko or will it be Yulia Tymoshenko? Or will Hrytsenko sneak in at the very last minute? A wise politician might say, okay, let's say take Yulia. She could say, I need to make deals here. People accuse me of perhaps showing a tendency to be more softly disposed in showing a tendency, no proof, towards Putin. Why don't I propose that Poroshenko, if he loses, becomes Minister of Defense or Commander-in-Chief, or Hrytsenko takes this role? I mean, there are many permutations, and we will see these permutations being brought into action after the results of the first round. What compromises will be made in all countries? The US, for example, the rhetoric changes from the first round to the second round, and we can expect the same. Right now, let's remember that of the 44 candidates that started, we don't have as many, 39 or whatever it is now. Most of them are pitching for image-making purposes, to position themselves to be partners in alliances and to have a share of the political and economic pie in October. And the key ones here, I would suspect that Zelensky and Tymoshenko are in tandem behind the scenes. I would suspect, logic tells me that, and that Poroshenko is really, and his advisors are really feeling pressured, and that are sensing more than ever that they might actually lose. So anything could happen. The stakes are very high. But remember, even though the stakes are very high, whoever becomes president, it's a thankless task. It's a kamikaze president. There are huge problems. There are huge debts to be repaid. There are huge expectations of society, and there's a war going on. So even if they win, they will have to use politics as the art of the possible to build consensus and a coalition around ideas that will actually sustain the country and sustain their power.